All right, hey everybody, this is SFL Live, the second episode of SFL Live. We are going to be talking today with some SFL activists about some current events that have been popular in the blogosphere, as well as what they're doing for activism in their own lives. So first, I just start off with telling you a little bit about SFL if you are unaware. Students for Liberty is a nonprofit international organization that works to empower students across the globe with resources to promote liberty on their own college campuses. We promote a basically broad version of liberty, basically, just broadly libertarianism, social freedom, economic freedom, intellectual and academic freedom. So, digging the red, nice. Okay. Yes, let's all take a second to compliment Kelly's hair. Actually, I'm a big fan of it. Let's start off a little bit with our viewers then, or with our guests rather. I don't know anything about our viewers other than that for some reason they're interested in what we have to say. So first we have Ryan Lee. Ryan got involved in the Liberty movement through the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, or FIRE, and he served as a leader for Students for Liberty for over the previous year. He now works full-time at Liberty.me as communications associate and is trying to advance liberty on the West Coast. We also have Dustin Brennan. Dustin is a Georgist anarchist studying computer science and political science at Texas State University. He is commonly referred to as the last living Georgist. He was probably not true, but it's funny anyway. He's on the first Students for Liberty Texas exec board as the programs manager, and his interests include proprietary and contractual communities, geo-libertarianism, and crypto-anarchism. And he's recently been focusing on introducing Georgist ideas into the greater libertarian movement. And also, Dustin was with us last week, if you all remember his beautiful face, so maybe he'll be joining us regularly. We also have Jake Fuller. Jake is a microbiology senior at Texas Tech University. He's also a student activist and a member of the Texas SFL Executive Board. He'll be directing the first ever West Texas SFL Regional Conference this coming fall, and he hopes to study neuroeconomics and the science of how our environment and incentive structures influence the mechanisms of human choice. So pretty wordy stuff. We also have Kelly V, who is a former SFL activist, and she's also an aspiring accountant. She is an anarcho-feminist, and I'm really just doing this all ad lib because she didn't give me a bio. But that pretty much sums up her political views, I think. Anarcho-feminist, pretty radical left libertarian. And I would also like to mention, before we all get into the questions, the hashtag for our discussion is SFLive, SFLIVE. So if you have any questions for that, feel free to promote it on Twitter and ask, and we'll definitely see your questions on Twitter, and we'll respond to them when we get a chance. So let's get down to our topics. The first thing I kind of want to talk about was and I'll post all the articles that we reference in the Liberty Me chat if you want to look for yourself. So yesterday on the SFL blog there was an article posted by Rory McPeak called "Can a Libertarian Support Obamacare?" And he eventually concludes that yes, a libertarian can. He appeals to Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman's positions on certain redistribution schemes to say that maybe libertarianism isn't completely incompatible with the Affordable Care Act. He also mentions in passing he rejects the kind of the hardline non-aggression principle view, the hardline libertarian rights view that maybe some people will call Rothbardian or Lockean or something. And so obviously the ACA seems to come into conflict with that, but if you don't embrace that view, maybe it's workable into your libertarian idea system. So I kind of wanted to ask our guests, I mean, do you think that there is any way we can, do you think Rory is right in that maybe some of our libertarian scholars before us kind of show why the ACA might be more compatible with libertarianism than more people give credit for? I mean, he says, I'll quote him for his, I think his best defense of the compatibleness is found probably here. He doesn't accept the struggle for egalitarianism, but rather he sees the ACA as not a strive for equality, but securities that allow people to take risks, be entrepreneurial, and move between socioeconomic strata within their own lifetime. So, I mean, obviously, on the face of it, that seems compatible and and helpful to a free market economic system, giving people the ability to take risks and be entrepreneurial. So what do you all think about this? Ryan, what do you think of Rory's argument?
I'm going to defer on Roy's argument for now, and because I want to hear the arguments, and I have a couple counter arguments to put forth into a mindset. But if we can defer to like Jake or Dustin or Kelly to hear some arguments for Corey or for Rory, I'm sorry, and I'll come back with some healthcare counter arguments.
Okay. So Dustin, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, at first glance, what I'm kind of getting, like, I always kind of put things into perspective of whether you're creating markets or destroying markets. You know, like, we'll talk about the healthcare thing that's going on in Nevada. You know, you're coming from a socialized institution and promoting markets through it. If you're going the other way, I don't really see how that's even remotely libertarian. So I don't agree with it at all.
All right. I mean, that seems to be the standard view. Jake, do you dissent? Do you find any value in Rory's argument on how the ACA could be compatible with libertarian free market economics?
I think, personally, I think it depends on how much of the ACA we're referring to. For example, Rory focuses almost exclusively on the individual mandate, and within a broad take of the libertarian tradition, I see how you could argue that, sure, some versions of libertarians, particularly maybe more Milton Friedman-esque classical liberals, could get behind an individual mandate, but there are also plenty of other reasons to be concerned about the Affordable Care Act excluding that. And one issue of concern I have, as he mentions, you quoted at the end that he mentions an interest in allowing people to move between socioeconomic strata within their own lifetimes. And my question would simply be, do we know whether or not the Affordable Care Act will even enable that to happen? If it won't, that's a good argument if it works, but if it doesn't, then the best argument is just falling on its face.
Right, yeah, I definitely agree. It seems like the way he appeals to Hayek is kind of misguided, because it seems like Hayek supported, even if you think his support for redistribution schemes is unlibertarian, they're clearly different in kind, because what Hayek was trying to do was trying to support some kind of redistribution scheme, like outside the market or in such a way that wouldn't affect the price system, so it wouldn't distort the information that prices convey. But the ACA doesn't do that at all, right? It's a bunch of price controls. It's not outside the market at all. So I think Hayek wouldn't support it, although he may support maybe some kind of minimum basic income or voucher thing. I'm not really sure. Kelly, what do you think of this?
I don't think you're going to find a lot of support for Rory's article here with any of us. I want to kind of take a stab at something else that he said in his article, that people often refer to him as a left libertarian for holding this position. We've got four left libertarians in here that maybe can help better outline what left libertarianism entails. But anyway, back to Rory's thing. No, I mean, I think he basically takes the argument that every libertarian had some issue that they sucked on, and this just happens to be his. I think this is clearly a program that expands government power. It helps corporations more than it helps individual people who are struggling. It's a farce of a program, basically. So that's all I really have to say about it.
Definitely. I definitely was shocked by someone calling him a left libertarian. But I'd hate to get derailed onto the topic of left libertarianism, especially because we seem to have probably a biased guest this episode. But also, I would like to look at one of the questions in the chat. Guest T-Raz, not really sure if I'm pronouncing that right, but they say, at one point, can you say, man, this free market thing is not working out, or is that just something libertarians are never prepared to say? So I think really that ties into the question of what Rory mentions in his article, in that, well, we have some libertarians who are dedicated to the non-aggression principle view as the foundation, and we have others maybe that are more consequentialist. So I'm curious how our guests here pan out in terms of that. Is there a point at which you'd say it's okay for the individual mandate or to use some force at some point to achieve maybe a better healthcare system, or for you is it completely a question of rights? Dustin, did you what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. So when we were talking about, in part in the article where he's talking about struggle for egalitarianism, he wants securities to be entrepreneurial. I think I'm going to invoke that which is seen and that which is unseen. These are great. These are great ends. Like he's saying, I want people to be entrepreneurial. I want people to be able to move between those socioeconomic strata. But the issue is that's not what the Affordable Care Act does. It's what actually happens is not what he intends. So I think that's kind of like my biggest issue. If we're going to go back to whether the market provides or not, if you just look at exactly what the Affordable Care Act has been doing to our healthcare system, it's obviously not helping at all. So I think that having markets, promoting markets, I think is, at least in this situation, and I'm open to people to promote off, talk about market failures in certain circumstances. But in this circumstance, I don't think there's any evidence that the Affordable Care Act is achieving that end.
Oh, sorry, I was muted for that second. Okay, that makes sense to me. Jake? Do you think there's at any point where we could say that maybe the ACA itself isn't the right solution, but do you think there's a point at which we could say, well, the free market maybe fails in this regard, so we'll use some government action and some force to fix it?
I have.
Go ahead.
Okay. I have two thoughts on that, actually. The first is with regard to healthcare in particular. I would almost love to have the question clarified, because if we're talking about the current healthcare system, we're so far removed from what is already a free market that it's almost nonsensical to talk about the Affordable Care Act in particular as something that's taking us away from the free market. Like, if you look at the past 80 years of progress, or maybe not progress, but change in healthcare policy, we've moved steadily and steadily away from what is a market system. And so to say, if we're talking about what we had before the Affordable Care Act and saying, at what point do we just admit this isn't working and do something else, it's not really a fair argument, because we didn't already have anything close to a free market. With regard to whether or not we throw in the towel at a certain point, I had a really interesting conversation with someone once where we were discussing this very topic, about at what point do you say that maybe would you admit that freedom has hit a limit? And the problem with this topic actually is that if people really are free to choose what's best, then they're free to choose what's best. And if it turns out that a complete market of options is not what's best, and people are free to choose what is best because they're in a market, then if socialism happened to be better, they could choose it, and they probably would if it really were better. So I don't think it's a scenario in which we can say, no, let's mandate that we get rid of the market. Instead, if the market itself opted away from itself, that would be one thing.
Sure, I definitely think it's a good point. It seems like Rory and a lot of the other people in this conversation, or not in this specific conversation, but in the healthcare conversation generally, are kind of starting in the middle. They're kind of asking, they're forgetting the fact that, yeah, right, we don't really have a free market in healthcare, so it's like you're kind of just starting in the middle of the story. You're not really getting to the foundation or the roots of the problem. Kelly, did you want to comment on the rights question, or maybe on what Jake or Justin said?
Yeah, sure. As to the rights versus efficiency comment, I think if you're looking at this from a utilitarianism itself is kind of a dangerous approach to anything. It's not an approach that commits us to libertarianism necessarily. There are a lot of examples I can think of off the top of my head where if you're really just looking at greater good versus individual and always choosing the greater good because that's the utilitarian approach. I mean, let's take an example. Let's say we live on an island with 50 people and 10 of them are redheads and everyone hates them. So let's just kill all the redheads and everyone will be happier. That's a utilitarian approach, technically. I mean, it's better for the greater good, but it's obviously a massive rights intrusion and results in the death of 1/5 of the population. Utilitarianism, if you follow it to its natural conclusion, finds us making a lot of excuses for big status policies in the short term and neglecting to think about the long-term effects of those policies or thinking about the way those affect the rights of the individual. So I think if we're looking at any policy I mean, government itself is an intrusion on rights. So if you value human dignity and kind of a man qua man view each person as an ends in themselves, you can't reasonably argue for any government policy, because the enforcement of those policies relies on the violation of rights.
Right.
So,
I definitely agree that utilitarianism it's dangerous. It can definitely lead to some pretty bizarre and horrible solutions that almost nobody would support. So I'll go back to Ryan here. You said that you wanted to kind of offer a counter argument after other guests spoke. So go ahead. Let's hear what you have to say.
Yeah, well, to start off, I saw a meme on Liberty Me the other day, and it was a picture of, this has a lot to do with this. It has a picture of the Breaking Bad, and it's like, if you ever need to know how American healthcare is, just watch this show. Like, this guy had to start making meth to pay for his medical bills. It's insane. But Rory mentioned in his article, he was talking about how, as a libertarian, like, we feel like you can't force someone to buy a product off the good, which is what the ACA is doing. But a counter argument that I want to provoke you guys to talk up about is, for uninsured people, are you not forcing taxpayers to eat that bill for uninsured people across the world? Like, that's an argument that gets brought up a lot in non-libertarian circles, and that's the circles I have to talk to a lot. So what would your suggestion be to answer that? Because, I mean, uninsured people are getting, quote unquote, this medical care for free, and then it goes on taxes, and the taxpayers are paying it. So is that not forcing the taxpayers into something?
Right. It's definitely a good thing to consider. I think maybe something that we do overlook in these debates. So does anyone want to jump in on maybe addressing that kind of concern that non-libertarians will bring to the table about healthcare? Dustin or Jake or Kelly. I could also offer my opinion. Kelly, go ahead. You got to unmute yourself.
Okay, I unmuted myself. Yeah, so I think part of the problem with health insurance is how we approach it in the first place. If you think about car insurance or home insurance or any other type of insurance, the way it's used is in case of emergency. I don't buy insurance planning for something to happen. I buy insurance in case something happens. Health insurance, on the other hand, is a totally different game. You use your health insurance for regular doctor's visits, and because of that, it drives the cost of a doctor's visit up tremendously, because doctors can charge so much because they have insurance companies to pay for it. And part of that is based on government regulation, based on the way government deals with doctors. Medicare and Medicaid have their own special pricing for doctor's appointments, etc. So I think part of the problem is just basically how we deal with insurance. But forcing people to buy insurance does not get at the source of the problem. If by forcing people to buy insurance, and then so that they won't rely on taxpayers to pay for their health care or whatever, is totally ignoring the reason that health care costs so much in the first place. So I think if we're trying to get at the root of the problem, we need to take a completely different approach. But I want to hear what Jake has to say about this.
Okay. So first, I couldn't agree more. One of the things that's most interesting to me is that there's a slight level of irony that we're talking about health insurance and no one takes a medical diagnosis approach to how to solve the problem, which is what's the cause of the problem in the first place, and we don't really address that or discuss that in the public policy forum. But just from a historical perspective, and I'll do some digging around when this podcast is over to see if I can find the correct reference. But at an IHS seminar a couple of years ago, I spoke with an historian who was working on a book on the history of healthcare in the United States, covering the past 80 or 90 years. And one thing she covered was the difference in how people handled medical insurance before we started to heavily regulate this industry. And a lot of what happened was health insurance once was, well, first of all, health insurance didn't exist in a truly refined sense, but it was also emergency only. And a lot of it was set up in kind of a co-op sense, where you would have a co-op of doctors, and people would pay into this co-op some sort of pre-agreed rate. and their rate wouldn't go up when they received the service. They were simply paying for the service, right? And then after a while, the American Medical Association, which is not unlike the Fed in that it's a private organization that has been given a regulatory monopoly on an industry that's not really governed by politics anymore. The American Medical Association decided that it was unreasonable for doctors to have a financial interest in serving their clients. In other words, the fact that they're directly getting paid by their clients. They thought this would corrupt incentives, when in reality we know from market this is actually a promoter of good incentives, generally speaking. But so the American Medical Association stepped in and said, well, we need an intermediary to actually receive the money and pay the doctors, and thus insurance as we now knew it was kind of born. And then you have another step of the playing field, which is where FDR puts some wage caps in place during the New Deal, and so employers are looking for a new way to try and incentivize people to come work for them. And so they say, okay, well, we'll pay your medical insurance because we can't pay you more because we're not allowed to. And so then you have the birth of employer-provided health care. And those two things really set the stage for insurance that covered everything, not just the occasional accident, and that's why you see that huge spike in costs.
Interesting. Definitely seems to, yeah, again, going back to what you said before, it seems like a lot of these discussions are starting in the middle, that we forget how our system is definitely not a free market healthcare system, and like you said, we can go back and look at specific government interventions that might have had unintended consequences, resulting in huge insurance costs and a really shitty healthcare system. Does anybody else have any more comments on this? It seems like there's a general agreement that it's definitely going to be very difficult to make the ACA compatible with libertarianism, if not just for the horrible way that the ACA proposes to solve the healthcare problem. It might not even be just a question of rights. It seems to me that you all think it's just a question of the ACA is just a bad solution in general. Even if you did think violating rights is okay, I can't imagine the ACA being a great solution. Does anybody else have any more comments on this? I'd be glad to hear anything else, or maybe we can move on to our next topic. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about is some news. I'm going to post it right there in the chat. Nevada has enacted a universal school choice. So to give a brief rundown, Nevada Governor Brian Sandoval signed into law the nation's first universal school choice program. It's created an option to every single public choice student, or public school student. Public choice. Well, I got economics on the mind. Even better, this option improves upon the traditional voucher model, coming in the form of an education savings account that parents control and can use to fully customize their children's education. So to give a little more details, the amount is somewhere between $5,100 and $5,700 annually, according to the Friedman Foundation for Educational Choice. And they are deposited quarterly into a debit card, which parents can use to pay for a variety of education-related services and products. So that ranges from private school tuition, online learning, special education services and therapies, books, tutors, dual enrollment college courses, plenty of other options. And also worth mentioning is that there is, the way they set this up is that the money rolls over, so it creates an incentive for parents to economize on what they're buying. So like the article I linked in the chat says, it's the only choice model to date that puts downward pressure on prices. Parents consider not only the quality of education services they receive, but the cost, since they can save unused funds for future education expenses. So this is an interesting topic for me, because we all love choice, right? I mean, we're libertarians. That seems to be crucial to our idea system. But on the other hand, I've heard some arguments by libertarians that possibly school voucher system might create more unintended consequences that are more harmful to liberty in the long run, and that maybe it's not the best solution to creating a good education system. So what do you all have to say? Ryan, do you want to go ahead and maybe tell us what you think of this?
Yeah, sure. Well, first of all, this new system that's happening is not actually, it doesn't seem to be the old voucher way, it was kind of like a small solution to a bigger problem. But there's two things that the article struck me. One is that 90% of the funds that would have been spent on a normal student, your run-of-the-mill student, that only 90% of the funds will be translated into this bank, or whatever you want to call it, to put your school through private school or dual enrollment or any of that. But 100% goes for poor children or from low-income families, or children with special needs. And I think it's awesome that 100% goes to them, but I also think 100% should go to the regular students, like the run-of-the-mill. So I want to see y'all's opinions on that, why it's only 90% as opposed to every dime that would be spent. And there's another interesting fact I found, that $5,100 to $5,700 annually that you said was spent, like that's not a lot of money. But I looked up, I did some research, and Nevada spends an average of $20,656 per inmate per year. And that's something I don't want to take us off too much. I don't want to derail us, but that's 4 times the amount that is spent on a student. And that also puts a huge spotlight on our prison system and the amount of work that we need to do in that area as well. So, your opinions?
I kind of like the contrast you brought in to discuss the prison system compared to the education system. I'm curious to what extent they differ, because it seems like they're very similar in a lot of regards. But that's definitely a good point to kind of shows how maybe the government has just really bizarre priorities in spending 4 times as much on prisoners, or at least per prisoner in our prison system, than students. So what about Dustin? Do you want to maybe comment on, do you think this kind of voucher-esque but not really program is a step in the right direction?
Yeah, I don't think, well, I would like to think that there's nobody really on this panel that would say that it's a step in the wrong direction. How big of a step in the right direction it is, I think, is really what we're going to kind of maybe butt heads over if we do butt heads. But I also, I want to give credit to what Ryan said about, like with the prison system, the amount of money, like priorities are screwed up. Like I'll completely acknowledge that, but the fact that, again, like I mentioned on the last question, I mean, you're going from a completely socialized institution to something that's going to create downward pressure on prices, promote markets, and I think that, any way you look at it, that is a step in the right direction. So.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to disagree. I mean, I guess maybe to play devil's advocate here, it says in the article that I linked, students must also take a national norm reference test in math and reading, a light touch that doesn't dictate students take a uniform state test. So this is really all the details I can find in the article on the testing. And I can't really tell the specifics. It seems like, and I know a common argument of libertarians who think vouchers are going in the wrong direction maybe is that, well, we're still having the state in control of the standards. So as long as the state's in control of the standards, it still seems to have that horrible influence that we want to get rid of. And I can't tell to what extent that this system gets rid of that, because it says there's a national norm reference test, but it says that's different from the uniform state test. And I'm not sure to what extent it differs. But even if it was a uniform state test, I mean, like you said, it does seem to still go in the direction of markets. So Kelly, do you want to comment? Do you think this is a step in the right direction?
I mean, yeah, I think it's a step in the right direction, but I also think that the way it's set up is pretty problematic. The testing is problematic. I don't really understand can you clarify maybe the details of the testing? Is it like a standardized test on the students, or is it on the institution itself?
All of the article says, from what I can tell, is that there is some sort of, quote, national norm reference test in math and reading, a light touch that doesn't dictate students take a uniform state test. So I guess we're left to wonder exactly how similar is this norm reference test to the state test. And even if it's close to it, I still have a hard time thinking this is a step in the wrong direction. But you're definitely right to point out that as long as we have the state in charge of what counts as good education and testing students to make sure that their education is great instead of leaving that up completely to parents' decisions in a marketplace, we're gonna have a problem. Jake, do you have any specific thoughts on this, or are you generally in agreement? Or
I'm generally in agreement. I do see the concern that Kelly and Dustin brought up is one that I share, that this is a step in the right direction, but it's not. It's more of a half measure where maybe a full measure is necessary, particularly leaving the state in charge of what is effectively still just one step removed from a solid standardized testing regime. But I still think, despite that, like there are problems in maybe how the information is conveyed and problems in how children are educated in the public school system, sure. But school choice is a big step, though only a step of improvement, because you have parents getting to levy some money around in terms of how and where their kids are going to get educated. I think it's a heavy improvement, and lots of the information, while maybe conveyed in not the most effective manner, is still good information. Maybe the mathematics, for example, is taught in a way that makes children hate math, which is unfortunate, but it is still correct information.
Okay, yeah, I mean, that definitely makes sense. Ryan, did you have any last comments, maybe on this, or on how you see it relating to the prison system?
I do agree with all of them that it's a step in the right direction. It's definitely not just a fix to the whole system, but with it not, we'll see. We can only see what happens with it not being this voucher system, with it being able to roll over. But I would love to see more money going to the future. The future minds of, honestly, the future minds and not the prison systems. But we can get into a 30-minute, hour-long discussion on how crappy our prison systems are, and I don't want to get us on that track.
All right. Well, I mean, it is a pretty depressing track, so I definitely sympathize with not wanting to go down that rabbit hole. So let's move on. I think we're all in somewhat agreement about how useful that kind of voucher-esque system is that Nevada has put into place. I guess we will have to see how it works. So this article that I want to discuss, I'll post in the chat. It's from Vox.com, and it's called "Steven Pinker Explains How Capitalism is Killing War." So if people are unfamiliar, Steven Pinker, he's a Harvard psychologist whose book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, makes the strongest case yet that the world is getting progressively more peaceful. Basically, he shows statistics that seem to imply that, contrary to popular opinion, there are less wars and less deaths from war, accounting for population differences now than there ever has been. So we could definitely quibble about the data, and there seems to be some scholars who are questioning his data in the book, but nonetheless, it seems to be more or less on the right track. So in this specific article, they talk about the relationship between capitalism and war, and I mean, he makes a very libertarian argument that, and without maybe getting into what capitalism actually is or how it's used maybe in some of the more communist anarchist circles or something, for all intents and purposes, he's talking about just free people trading goods and services, which is really just what we're for, I think, generally. So let me go ahead and quote a little bit of what Steven Pinker says, and let me get your all's thoughts on if he's actually on the right track. So the interviewer asks, one story you hear from political scientists for why there's been less war recently is that it's just less profitable. Countries don't gain very much economically or politically from taking over new land anymore. Excuse me. Does that seem right to you? And Pinker says, yes, it's one of the causes. It's the theory of the capitalist peace. When it's cheaper to buy things than to steal them, people don't steal them. Also, if other people are more valuable to you alive than dead, you're less likely to kill them. So you don't kill your customers or your lenders, and the arrival of an infrastructure of trade and commerce reduces some of the sheer exploitative incentives of conquest. And he even references how the idea goes back to the Enlightenment and Adam Smith, and even the founders when they built incentives for free trade into the Constitution, which I guess we can argue about that another day if that's particularly historically accurate, but not the point. And he says he's not sure if it's the entire story for the decline in war, but it seems to be very important that countries are now trading with each other more, and that creates a disincentive for countries to war with each other. So what do you all think of this? What do you think this has to say maybe about the views on like maybe free market defense systems or something? I mean, it's interesting to read this article from an anarchist point of view about maybe how if we'd have more war or less. Without states, if it was merely defense firms competing for profits in charge of, or responsible for providing us with defense. I'm kind of just generally looking for, what do you all think of this? Justin, let's go to you first.
Yeah, there's that old, if goods don't cross borders, then bombs will, or something to that effect. I think that rings true, like, of this article. I'm also kind of I can't remember the exact data that he pulled from, but John Mackey at one of the International Students for Liberty conferences basically pointed out a lot of stuff about how we don't really realize like how much we've come. You know, we're kind of stuck in the here and now. But if you look at, you know, since the 1700s, 1800s, you know, and what's happened like since then, and the amount of wealth that's been created, you know, and the amount, obviously in this case, how much, you know, war's gone down. You know, it's easy to kind of, you know, overlook that, you know, when you're stuck, you know, and you're kind of the day-to-day humdrum of stuff. So I do think that, you know, to the extent, I guess, you know, if I want to play devil's advocate, some of the questions I would ask is, if war's going down, is there anything else that's going up? I've heard it saying that, like in the UK, for example, you know, yeah, you know, they banned guns, but then violence went up. Just general violence in general went up. You know, not necessarily with guns. So it just kind of reappeared in another place. So I don't really have that kind of data, but you know, if I was trying to make sure it was 100% correct, or to you know, anything like that, I would definitely want to look into anything like that. Has there been any maybe poverty gone up or anything like that, to kind of see, you know, what is there anything that replaced this?
Right, I think that's definitely a good thing to consider. I didn't really think of that when reading the article. I mean, it's easy to have a optimistic mindset when you're only looking at one set of data and maybe ignoring other unintended consequences. So I guess that's worth considering, but like you said, it would require a little more data to look into. I'd be skeptical that there are other unintended consequences that are really coming down from a decline in war. And if anything, I'd imagine positive unintended consequences from a decline in war. So Jake, do you have anything to say about this?
Yes, absolutely, actually. One thing, I'd love to quote a different section of the article, if that's all right. It'll be a slight change in direction, but at one point, Pinker addresses perhaps the difference in how the people in charge of armies, notably world leaders, handle the option of going to war now versus previously. And he says, quite across from calculations of interest that are titled by international markets and institutions, there's the idea of norms. He starts talking about social change here and how norms change over time. He says, what you consider and don't consider as a legitimate possible move changes. Some scholars argue that the main factor is that war has been delegitimated, at least among the great powers and the developed states, as a thinkable option. He later says that at one point in time in the 19th century, that war was just another policy option for national leaders, and it was just as normal as anything. And now it's just not something that decent leaders do if they can avoid it. What's fascinating about this is he probably realizes it, but he's harping on the significance of the discovery, at least in the realm of politics, of the primacy of the win-win relationship. Why go to war when you don't have to? The norms change, and so one thing that happens, I'm very interested in the social change aspect of this, because later in the article he gets into discussing different values and how some people, he mentions ISIS and Vladimir Putin as groups that are more than happy to go to war for certain causes that most of us wouldn't consider legitimate enough, but that those two groups of people happen to find perfectly fine reasons to go to war, and the question is why. And maybe one of the reasons, he doesn't really dig into why, but I would want to explore why. And what I'm thinking is, one thing that happens as soon as you have free trade is people realize there's this whole better option. And as Dustin mentioned, it's really easy to get caught up in the here and now. But if we take a historical perspective, for the vast majority of history, people haven't realized there's a way to operate in terms of interacting with other people that could lead to win-win scenarios. People just didn't know, which is mind-boggling to think about. People didn't know you could just interact in a positive sum-game fashion, but once people discovered that, they realized there was a new way to interact. And so the need to fight one another for resources goes away, and this radically changes society such that political leaders no longer think, oh, let's just toss 10,000 people to the wayside in a battle just to, you know, win over the Grand Duchess's nephew or something, you know. And so I'm just interested. It's fascinating how markets will change norms over time because of the benefit of trade.
Yeah, I mean, that's definitely a good point. I don't see how anyone could really disagree how, I mean, trade incentivizes peace, right? I mean, it creates win-win scenarios, like you said. Seems the more government gets involved, the more win-lose scenarios we get involved with. So Kelly, do you have any comments on this article?
Yeah, definitely. Contrary to what Dustin and Jake said, I think this article is overly optimistic. I do think that free markets lead to less war. However, I am not sure that's exactly what's happening. If you look at what the article points to as data, it's pointing to worldwide battle deaths per 100,000 people, and those have a very obvious decline. But also, you have to look at the way that wars are fought now. We're not doing hand-to-hand combat in the field anymore. That's just not how it works. Obviously, we're going to have less casualties. A lot of the way war works now is posturing, buying mass amounts of weapons, intimidating other countries. It's a lot less hand-to-hand combat and a lot more, oh, look at my guns, they're bigger than yours, fight me. And of course, no one's going to jump into a war with someone that has nukes because nuclear war is too destructive for any of us to be able to deal with. So I think that perhaps deaths have declined, but also if you look at the history of wars, a lot of it's based on seizing capital, fighting over who has the right to what goods, and generally interfering with markets. Sorry, I'm getting distracted by the comments over here. I think that an anti-war, pro-free market approach is necessary, but I think that this kind of cause and effect article ignores the way that wars are fought now and doesn't account for the lack of data we have in a lot of civil wars in the Middle of the East. A lot of that data just isn't available. Wars are fought maybe less formally or just in a different way. So I think we still have a long way to go as far as that goes. But Jake and Dustin had a response to me.
Oh, hey, I never muted myself. Whoops. We're still here. One interesting criticism, very much in the lines of what Kelly mentioned, that I've heard of the whole book, Angels Over Better Nature, that Steven Pinker's drawing from here, is that at least in the book he tries to draw some really big conclusions about violence generally, not just international war, but violence generally. And one thing he fails to address completely is how governments treat their own citizens beyond body count. So he concerns himself very heavily with body count, but as Kelly mentioned, wars are not waged strictly by body count. Sometimes it's a lot of posturing and threatening and oppressing that doesn't necessarily involve killing someone. And if you can imagine for a moment, maybe everyone in the world has a gun to their head, and so no one dies because no one's stupid enough to do something illegal when a gun's pointed right at their head, but that doesn't mean we're free, right? And so there's an interesting problem of he particularly doesn't address domestic policy. For example, how do we consider the violence associated with the drug war domestically? Those bodies aren't even counted in this data. Never mind the people that don't die in the war on drugs in the United States. And let's not even, we can go far beyond the United States. The drug war is much worse in Latin America than it is here, and it's directly since U.S. policy. So there are a lot of things that are left unaddressed, and while the article doesn't focus on the general wide conclusions of violence generally, his book at least does. And it has some holes in terms of exactly what counts as violence and what counts as oppression, because all that Pinker generally concerns himself with is the number of people who have died. And it's much more complex, much more nuanced than that.
Cool. Yeah, so I really just wanted to kind of elaborate on what she was talking about with how wars are fought differently. I was in the Army for 6 years. I've been to Iraq twice. And looking at, just kind of the change in dynamic, you can look at how countries are fighting each other now. I mean, they're doing it over the internet. There's hackers that are hired that are, going in and doing digital kind of wars. You have right now there's a lot less kind of ground troops, and they're really, hiring a whole lot of special forces kind of people, not to go in mass numbers, but to go in and cause civil unrest, to go in and do economic terrorism and things like that. So, there's a lot of, the battle deaths have gone down, but, like I said at the end of my last comment, I mean, I'd like to see, what are the unseen effects of our kind of change of dynamic of the way the battles are fought nowadays. There's going to be, obviously, if systems get hacked, government systems get hacked, that's going to cause issues. If there's economic terrorism, where things are being inflated or, economies are destroyed, that's obviously going to have an effect. So I can't, I don't want to downplay the benefit of battle deaths going down, but I mean, there's, it's not that the wars have stopped, it's just they've kind of changed the way that they're being done. So you need to look at those effects and put those into context with the battle deaths going down to get a full picture.
Yeah, I agree 100%, and I think you said it best. Like, death is not the only negative effect of war. There, economic, and there's so many other negative effects of war. But I want to jump also to a section of the article, and it talks about that things are moving in a positive direction. Which, I mean, it seems via the graph and via the article, it seems like there is, but. The fact isn't transforming the American public discourse. When it says, talking about the Republican presidential campaign, you have people saying, quote, "We have never seen more threats against our nation and its citizens than we do today." And you see that a lot. You see that on mainstream media sources and all of this fear that people are putting, that these media sources and news outlets are putting into the American people. And Jeffrey Tucker and Scott Horton talked last night and had an amazing discussion about how the media makes you fear of something, and then as soon as that doesn't come to fruition, they have something else in the news that the following morning to distract you from the fact that they were wrong the previous day. And I want to focus on the United States right now because it talks about how we are a peculiar case when it comes to this, because although the wars are declining or whatever, according to the article, we really aren't. And it talks about how because we are a culture of honor, that the threats and moral virtue consist in having the resolve to deal with them. And it pretty much like we have to prove that we're better, and we have to have this global police force, and we're the only country that can do it. And that does keep us wrapped up in these global conflicts, even if they're not ours. So I want to touch a little bit on that too, if we have the time.
Jake, did you have a comment, Jake?
Yeah, just thought Ryan might have wanted to touch on that right now. But the only, I just wanted to basically add to what he was saying. The quote that Ryan mentioned about the United States being more of an honor culture in some aspects is exactly what I was thinking about bringing up. And what's fascinating to me is that Pinker mentions two other examples of societies or countries that have engaged in war recently. The Russian war in Ukraine, which I don't know how much of it is just Putin and how much of it is more than just Putin, but Putin's definitely on board, along with probably some other people. And then you have ISIS as an example. One thing that's worth noting, at least, is that the notion of an honor society is something that's held in common with both of those two scenarios, and with the aspects of the United States that are still very interested in war. If you look at violent sects of Islam in the Middle East, it's all very much nestled in a regional culture of an honor society where dealing with threats or things that oppose to an ideology or morality have to be dealt with a high moral resolve that usually involves fighting. And that's obviously not true of Islam everywhere, but it's a regional thing, and it leads to things like ISIS. And it seems that Russia, or at least the people running Russia right now, have a similar mindset, and it's also present in conservative branches of the United States. And so we have this similar ideology of having the moral turpitude to deal with threats harshly if necessary. It seems to lead to more violence when it's necessary.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a good point. I think the part of the article you're touching on, the end, towards the end, it kind of explains. I mean, it's a battle of ideas, right? It's certain ideologies that tend to drive, certain warlike cultures or countries that tend to glorify war and battle and soldiers and stuff. So I think that's definitely crucial to our project, I think, in changing people's ideas about war and ultimately what's really honorable, because I don't think war is particularly honorable. But I think we have to move on here. We have about 5 or 6 minutes left, so I just want to briefly touch base with everyone on what they are doing to promote liberty in their own lives, their own activism and writing and such. So Kelly, do you want to go ahead and maybe give us a brief update on what you've been doing lately?
Sure. Well, I've recently excused myself from the activist scene. I decided to leave SFL so I could focus more on my writing. So right now I'm writing at c4ss.org, Center for Stateless Society, as well as thecirclemolinari.com, which a couple of us write for, so you should definitely check that out. Also, I've applied for a couple feminist blogs, so we'll see how that goes. So that's kind of what I'm doing to promote liberty right now, is just writing and hoping someone cares what I have to say.
Rad, okay. Very cool. Dustin, do you want to give us a brief update maybe?
Yeah, I'll go local, school, and then state. So like at our school in particular, a couple years ago we had like a little battle where we got, it was 45-3 in our student government for cite and release, which without getting in too much detail is essentially instead of for a certain list of offenses, instead of being arrested and thrown in jail, you get a ticket. Particularly I think it's marijuana possession, vandalism, and I think there's like 5 others. It passed through student government, got to the president's desk. She refused to sign it. So we're going to readdress that and try, and because a lot of students supported it, and see if we can get that done. On a state level, I know that concealed carry just passed, so I think that the big issue is going to be that they made an exception that they could have certain rules where they're gun-free zones on school. So I have a feeling a lot of schools are going to try and use that. So it's now it's redirecting the energy to basically make it to where it's just hold their feet to the fire essentially. I know that there was also kind of like a really weak marijuana law that was passed recently in Texas, so there's not a lot we can do with that right now, but it's definitely on our radar for the future for like long-term goals.
Very cool stuff. I wish you the best of luck with your on-campus stuff. Hope you win the good fight. Jake, do you maybe want to tell us a little bit about what you're doing?
Sure. Well, this summer I'm hoping to get my writing butt in gear and make some contributions to libertarianism that way. It's something I've been meaning to do for a while and just haven't sat down and done it. Larger than just me, though, at least as far as Texas Tech is concerned, I've got 2 CCs with Students for Liberty coming in, and we're going to be working to try and build up a larger growing community of progressive or heartfelt libertarians, per se. We have a good culture going out here with that, and we'd like to keep it going. We'll be hosting a regional conference in Lubbock in the fall, and right now the lineup we're looking at is primarily academic leaning or strictly academic people, all with anarchist tendencies, so that's kind of fun. I'm excited about that. And we'll be focusing on the humanitarian aspect of libertarianism at that conference. That's the plan anyway. We'll probably have a drug war event early on in the semester. We did that last year, and it's a big hot-button topic, at least out here, and students are always interested in it. As Dustin mentioned, we had a really soft marijuana law passed in Texas, so it just makes it all the more relevant current event-wise, but that's something we try to do annually now, and we'll be doing that again in some fashion.
Awesome, awesome. So I guess, Ryan, lastly, do you want to maybe tell us a bit about what you're up to?
Sure. Activism-wise, now that I'm graduated from university, it's been a little bit more difficult to do any student activism, but I am trying to get connected with the local YAL chapter here at UNLV. And but no, I moved full-time to work with Liberty.me and trying to promote content from young leaders such as yourself. So if there's anyone out there in the audience that has ever had any desire to write and wants to get their content on Liberty.me, feel free to send me an email at ryan@liberty.me, or any of you four as well. I would love to see. I know, Corey, you already write over here, but it would be awesome. And that's all I've been trying to do, is promote other people's writing and promote other people's activism. But I will be at Freedom Fest as well, so that'll be a lot of fun. And I hope to see viewers and all of you guys there. That'll be a really good activism event.
Awesome, very cool. So I guess just to wrap up, I want to tell you all a bit about the Liberty Live show tomorrow night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. We are going to be joined by Gary Gals, the author of Lines of Liberty, to chat about some of the greatest libertarian quotes in history. So that should be pretty interesting. I'll link to that in the chat in a second. And I guess that's about it for us. It's about 11 Eastern time right now. So just to wrap up, thanks to all the guests, Ryan, Kelly, Jake, and Dustin. You're all obviously invited back on whenever you want. It's been a really wonderful talk. I've learned a lot. And thank you to all our viewers and all our viewers who watch this on the recorded version. And don't forget to join us 2 weeks from tonight, same SFL time, same SFL channel, to hear from more student activists. And I look forward to seeing you all then. So, bye, everybody. Left libertarian. And I would also like to mention, before we all get into the questions, right, the hashtag for our discussion is SFLive, SFLIVE. So if you have any questions for that, feel free to promote it on Twitter and ask, and we'll definitely see your questions on Twitter, and we'll respond to them when we get a chance. So let's get down to our topics. The first thing I kind of want to talk about was and I'll post all the articles that we reference in the Liberty Me chat if you want to look for yourself. So yesterday on the SFL blog, there was an article posted by Rory McPeak called "Can a Libertarian Support Obamacare?" And he eventually concludes that yes, a libertarian can. He appeals to Friedrich Hayek and Milton Friedman's positions on certain redistribution schemes to say that maybe libertarianism isn't completely incompatible with the Affordable Care Act. He also mentions in passing he rejects the kind of the hardline non-aggression principle view, the hardline libertarian rights view that maybe some people will call Rothbardian or Lockean or something. And so, all right, hey everybody, this is SFL Live, the second episode of SFL Live. We are going to be talking today with some SFL activists about some current events that have been popular in the blogosphere, as well as what they're doing for activism in their own lives. So first, I just start off with telling you a little bit about SFL if you are unaware. Students for Liberty is a nonprofit international organization that works to empower students across the globe with resources to promote liberty on their own college campuses. And we promote a basically broad version of liberty, basically, just broadly libertarianism, social freedom, economic freedom, intellectual and academic freedom. So, digging the red, nice. Okay. Yes, let's all take a second to compliment Kelly's hair. Actually, I'm a big fan of it. So let's start off a little bit with our viewers then, or with our guests rather. I don't know anything about our viewers other than that for some reason they're interested in what we have to say. So first we have Ryan Lee. Ryan got involved in the Liberty movement through the Foundation for Individual Rights and Education, or FIRE, and he served as a leader for Students for Liberty for over the previous year. He now works full-time at Liberty.me as communications associate and is trying to advance liberty on the West Coast.
Or for Rory, I'm sorry, and I'll come back with some healthcare counter-arguments.
Okay, so Dustin, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, at first glance, what I'm kind of getting, I always kind of put things into perspective of whether you're creating markets or destroying markets. We'll talk about the healthcare thing that's going on in Nevada. You're coming from a socialized institution and promoting markets through it. If you're going the other way, I don't really see how that's even remotely libertarian. So I don't agree with it at all.
All right, I mean, that seems to be the standard view. Jake, do you dissent? Do you find any value in Rory's argument on how the ACA could be compatible with libertarian free market economics?
I think, personally, I think it depends on how much of the ACA we're referring to. For example, Rory focuses almost exclusively on the individual mandate, and within a broad take of the libertarian tradition, I see how you could argue that, sure, some versions of libertarians, particularly maybe more Milton Friedman-esque classical liberals, could get behind an individual mandate, but there are also plenty of other reasons to be concerned about the Affordable Care Act.
We also have Dustin Brennan. Dustin is a Georgist anarchist studying computer science and political science at Texas State University. He is commonly referred to as the last living Georgist. He was probably not true, but it's funny anyway. He's on the First Students for Liberty Texas Exec Board as the programs manager, and his interests include proprietary and contractual communities, geo-libertarianism, and crypto-anarchism. And he's recently been focusing on introducing Georgist ideas into the greater libertarian movement. And also, Dustin was with us last week, if you all remember his beautiful face, so maybe he'll be joining us regularly. We also have Jake Fuller. Jake is a microbiology senior at Texas Tech University. He's also a student activist and a member of the Texas SFL Executive Board. He'll be directing the first ever West Texas SFL Regional Conference this coming fall, and he hopes to study neuroeconomics and the science of how our environment and incentive structures influence the mechanisms of human choice. So pretty wordy stuff. We also have Kelly V, who is a former SFL activist, and she's also an aspiring accountant. She is an anarcho-feminist, and I'm really just doing this all ad lib because she didn't give me a bio. But that pretty much sums up her political views, I think. Anarcho-feminist, pretty radical. Obviously, the ACA seems to come into conflict with that, but if you don't embrace that view, maybe it's workable into your libertarian idea system. So I kind of wanted to ask our guests, I mean, do you think that there is any way we can, do you think Rory is right in that maybe some of our libertarian scholars before us kind of show why the ACA might be more compatible with libertarianism than more people give credit for? I mean, he says, I'll quote him for his, I think his best defense of the compatibleness is found probably here. He doesn't accept the struggle for egalitarianism, but rather he sees the ACA as not a strive for equality, but securities that allow people to take risks, be entrepreneurial, and move between socioeconomic strata within their own lifetime. So, I mean, obviously, on the face of it, that seems compatible and helpful to a free market economic system, giving people the ability to take risks and be entrepreneurial. So what do you all think about this? Ryan, what do you think of Rory's argument?
I'm going to defer on Roy's argument for now, and because I want to hear the arguments, and I have a couple counter arguments to put forth into a mindset. But if we can defer to like Jake or Dustin or Kelly to hear some arguments for Corey.